"You saved my tribe. Now I give you my daughter as wife," spoke the Apache elder. The blood on his hands had dried black under the desert sun, but Thaddeus Crane could still smell the iron tang mixed with gunpowder smoke clinging to his clothes. 3 days ago, he'd been nothing more than a drifter with empty pockets and a conscience heavy enough to sink him into the Rio Grande. Now as he stood before the Apache elder, whose weathered face bore the weight of 60 winters, those same blood-stained hands trembled, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what the old man was offering. The elder's voice carried across the circle of warriors like thunder rolling over canyon walls. Each word struck Thaddeus with the force of a rifle bullet, yet he found himself unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to process the reality of what he was hearing. The Apache camp stretched behind the elder, a collection of wickiups and lean-tos that seemed to emerge naturally from the red earth of the Sonoran desert. Women moved quietly between the structures, their dark eyes watching this strange, pale man who had stumbled into their world carrying death on his shoulders and salvation in his trigger finger. 3 nights earlier, Thaddeus had been riding hard through the mesquite and Palo Verde, his horse lathered with sweat and his own shirt soaked through despite the cool October air. The Mexican bandits had been trailing him since Tucson, their leader Diego Vasquez convinced that the gringo cowboy carried something worth killing for. Thaddeus carried nothing but regret and a Winchester rifle that had seen better days, but Vasquez was not a man to be reasoned with. The bandit leader had made his reputation gutting settlers and selling their children to slavers in Sonora. His cruelty was legend from El Paso to Phoenix, and his hunger for blood seemed insatiable. When Thaddeus finally dismounted near what appeared to be an abandoned waterhole, his horse stumbling from exhaustion, he thought he would make his stand alone. The desert had a way of swallowing men whole, leaving nothing but bleached bones and forgotten dreams. He had accepted this fate, checking his ammunition and preparing to sell his life as dearly as possible. The Winchester held 12 rounds. He counted them twice, knowing that 13 bandits rode with Vasquez, knowing that mathematics rarely favored the righteous. But the waterhole was not abandoned. The Apache warriors emerged from the landscape itself, as if the desert had taken human form to witness his final moments. Thaddeus counted 8 of them, their faces painted with ochre and charcoal, their weapons ranging from traditional bows to captured army carbines. They surrounded him in silence, their leader a man of perhaps 40 years, whose chest bore scars that spoke of battles won through cunning rather than brutality. This was not the greeting Thaddeus had expected, yet something in their manner suggested they had been watching, waiting, evaluating. When Vasquez and his men arrived an hour later, howling like coyotes and firing their pistols into the air, they found more than a lone cowboy waiting for them. The battle that followed lasted less than 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes rewrote the entire trajectory of Thaddeus Crane's existence. Fighting alongside warriors whose names he did not know, whose language he could not speak, he discovered a brotherhood forged in powder smoke and mutual desperation. The bandits fell one by one, their arrogance transformed into terror, as Apache arrows found gaps in their defenses, and Thaddeus's Winchester spoke with deadly precision. Vasquez himself died last, his gold teeth glinting in the firelight as he cursed in Spanish and reached for a hidden derringer. Thaddeus put 2 bullets in the bandit leader's chest before the smaller weapon cleared leather, ending a reign of terror that had lasted 3 bloody years. In the aftermath, as smoke drifted across the desert floor and the smell of death mingled with the scent of creosote and sage, the Apache leader approached Thaddeus with something approaching respect. His name was Naalnish, and he spoke English with the careful precision of a man who had learned the language from missionaries and soldiers, traders and treaty makers. Through him, Thaddeus learned that Vasquez had been hunting more than a lone drifter. The bandit leader had been tracking the Apache band, planning to capture women and children for the slave markets, preparing to add another atrocity to his long list of crimes against humanity. By standing with the Apache against a common enemy, Thaddeus had unknowingly prevented a massacre. Now 3 days later, he found himself the center of a ceremony he did not understand, surrounded by a culture as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. The elder continued speaking, his words translated by Naalnish, whose English carried the weight of gratitude and something deeper, something that sounded almost like destiny. The woman stepped forward from behind the circle of warriors, and Thaddeus felt his heart stop beating for several long seconds. She moved with the fluid grace of water flowing over stone, her long black hair adorned with silver ornaments that caught the firelight and threw it back in dancing patterns. Her dress was traditional Apache, crafted from deerskin and decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of hours spent in patient creation. But it was her eyes that captured him completely, dark and intelligent, holding depths that suggested she understood far more than she revealed. She could not have been more than 20 years old, yet there was an ancient wisdom in her gaze that made Thaddeus feel like a child, stumbling through a world he barely comprehended. Her name was Ayana, Nalnish explained, and she was the elder's only daughter, the light of his diminishing years, the keeper of stories and songs that connected their people to the generations who had walked before. She had been educated by Franciscan nuns in Santa Fe, spoke 4 languages fluently, and possessed a mind that could unravel the most complex problems with startling clarity. She was, in short, everything that Thaddeus Crane was not: refined where he was rough, educated where he was ignorant, rooted where he was endlessly adrift. The elder's proposal hung in the desert air, like smoke from a dying fire, impossible to ignore, yet difficult to fully comprehend. Marriage, a union between worlds that had spent the better part of a century trying to destroy each other. Thaddeus understood the honor being offered, recognized the magnitude of the gesture, yet felt completely unprepared for the responsibility it represented. He was a man who had spent the last 5 years running from his past, avoiding commitments, refusing to put down roots in soil that might demand more than he was willing to give. His own story began in Ohio, where his father had worked a farm that never quite produced enough to keep the family fed. The war between the states had taken his older brother, consumption had claimed his mother, and a combination of bad weather and worse luck had driven his father to drink and early death. Thaddeus had headed west in 1867 with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and the kind of restless energy that seemed to infect young men who had seen too much death and too little hope. He had worked cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, spent winters in mining camps where men died for the color of a playing card, served briefly as a sheriff's deputy in towns whose names he could barely remember. Always moving, always searching for something he could never quite define, always carrying the weight of decisions made in moments when survival mattered more than conscience. The Apache camp around him represented everything he had never known: stability, tradition, belonging. These people had lived in this desert for countless generations, their knowledge of the land so complete that they could find water where others saw only death, could track game across rock faces that looked identical to untrained eyes, could read the future in cloud formations and wind patterns. They possessed a wealth that had nothing to do with gold or silver, a richness that came from understanding their place in the greater tapestry of existence. Ayana spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the musical quality of someone comfortable with multiple languages. Her English was flawless, touched with only the slightest accent that made each word sound like a carefully chosen gift. "My father honors you for standing with us against those who would have brought great sorrow to our people, but he also sees something in you that perhaps you do not see in yourself, a man who has lost his way, but still carries honor in his heart." Thaddeus found himself studying her face in the firelight, searching for some sign of what she truly thought about this arrangement. Did she welcome her father's decision, or was she simply accepting it as the duty of a daughter to her clan? Her expression revealed nothing, yet something in her posture suggested she was as uncertain about this turn of events as he was. The ceremony that followed seemed to exist outside of normal time, a series of rituals and exchanges that connected him to traditions stretching back to the dawn of human memory. He accepted gifts he did not understand, spoke words in Apache that Nalnish coached him through, participated in dances that made him feel simultaneously foolish and strangely moved. Through it all, Ayana remained near the edge of the circle, watching with those intelligent dark eyes, evaluating this strange man who had stumbled into her world carrying violence and leaving behind something that resembled peace. When the formal ceremonies concluded and the other members of the band began to drift away to their evening routines, Thaddeus found himself alone with Ayana beside a small fire that had been prepared outside a wickiup that, he realized with something approaching panic, was apparently now his home. The desert night had settled around them like a familiar blanket, bringing with it the small sounds of camp life and the vast silence of the wilderness beyond. She offered him coffee brewed in a battered pot that looked like it might have been traded from Mexican merchants, and they sat in silence for several minutes, each apparently waiting for the other to begin a conversation that neither seemed to know how to start. "You are afraid," she said finally, and it was not a question. Thaddeus considered denying it, then realized that dishonesty would be a poor foundation for whatever relationship they were supposed to build. "Terrified," he admitted. "Good. A man who feels no fear when his life changes so completely is either a fool or a liar, and my father would not have chosen either for his daughter." There was something almost like humor in her voice, a gentle teasing that suggested she found his discomfort more amusing than troubling. "I do not know your ways," Thaddeus said carefully. "I do not know what kind of husband your people expect, what kind of man you need. And I do not know what kind of wife a cowboy from the eastern lands expects," she replied. "So we will learn together, or we will fail together. Either way, we will not face the unknown alone." The pragmatism in her voice surprised him. This was not the romantic notion of marriage that dominated the penny novels and frontier newspapers, but something far more honest, a partnership based on mutual benefit and shared uncertainty rather than passionate declarations that might not survive the harsh realities of daily existence. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked. She was quiet for so long that he began to think she would not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "Because my people are dying, not from bullets or disease, though those take their toll. We are dying from the loss of our old ways, from the pressure to become something we were never meant to be. The Indian agents want us to farm land that will not support crops, to worship a god who seems to care nothing for the desert or the animals that live here. They want our children to forget our language, our stories, our connection to this place that has been our home since the beginning of time." She paused, staring into the fire with eyes that reflected flames and something deeper. "A marriage between Apache and white might bridge two worlds, might show that we can adapt without losing everything that makes us who we are. Or it might be just another failure in a long line of broken promises and shattered dreams. But doing nothing guarantees that we will simply fade away like morning mist." Thaddeus began to understand that this arrangement was about far more than rewarding a stranger for helping in a fight. It was a desperate gamble, a chance to find some middle ground between cultural extinction and violent resistance. Ayanna was not just accepting marriage to a stranger. She was volunteering to be an experiment in survival, a test of whether two very different ways of seeing the world could coexist in the same heart. The magnitude of that sacrifice left him speechless. They talked through the night, sharing stories and attempting to map the vast territories of difference that separated their experiences. She told him about her childhood in the desert, about learning to find water by watching the flight patterns of birds, about the time she had spent with the Franciscan nuns, learning to read and write in English and Spanish. He told her about Ohio winters and cattle drives, about the weight of a gun in his hand, and the sound a man makes when he dies far from home. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Thaddeus realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. For the first time in years, he was not planning his next move, not calculating the best route of escape, not keeping one foot perpetually pointed toward the horizon. The woman beside him represented everything he had been running from: responsibility, connection, the possibility of belonging somewhere deeper than the temporary comfort of a rented room or a spot by a dying campfire. Yet, instead of the familiar panic that usually accompanied such realizations, he felt something that might have been peace. The sun rose over the Sonoran desert, illuminating a landscape that suddenly seemed less like a wasteland and more like home. The days that followed brought challenges that neither formal ceremonies nor nighttime conversations had prepared them to face. Thaddeus discovered that living among the Apache required unlearning almost everything he thought he knew about survival in the desert. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Sherman that had carried him faithfully across 3 territories, seemed clumsy and loud compared to the Apache ponies that moved across the rocky terrain with the silence of shadows. His boots, designed for stirrups and wooden floors, proved inadequate for the thorny landscape where Apache moccasins allowed their wearers to step with precision and stealth. Ayanna became his teacher in matters both practical and profound. She showed him how to read the subtle signs that indicated water hidden beneath apparently barren ground, how to identify plants that could provide food or medicine, how to move through the desert without leaving traces that would betray their presence to hostile forces. Her knowledge seemed limitless, drawn from generations of accumulated wisdom and sharpened by her own keen intelligence. But teaching him to survive in her world proved easier than bridging the cultural chasm that separated their understanding of fundamental concepts like time, property, and individual responsibility. The Apache operated on a communal basis that ran counter to everything Thaddeus had learned about self-reliance and personal achievement. Decisions that affected the group were made through consensus rather than individual authority, and the concept of owning land seemed as foreign to them as their spiritual connection to the desert seemed to him. The wiki-up they shared began to feel less temporary, as Ayana added small touches that transformed the simple structure into something approaching a home. She wove grass mats for the floor, arranged their few possessions with an eye for both beauty and practicality, created a space that felt intimate without feeling cramped. Thaddeus found himself looking forward to the evenings when they would sit by their small fire, sharing the events of the day and attempting to understand the vast differences in their worldviews. Their physical relationship developed slowly, constrained by mutual uncertainty and the knowledge that their entire community was watching for signs of success or failure in this unprecedented union. They slept on opposite sides of their shelter for the first week, maintaining a careful distance that spoke more of nervousness than lack of attraction. When they finally came together as husband and wife, it was with a tenderness that surprised them both, a recognition that they were creating something entirely new rather than simply fulfilling expected roles. The first serious test of their partnership came 3 weeks after the marriage ceremony, when Apache scouts brought word that a cavalry patrol was approaching from the east. The blue-coated soldiers represented everything that threatened the Apache way of life: government policies designed to force native peoples onto reservations, military commanders who saw Indians as obstacles to progress rather than human beings with legitimate claims to the land. A system that promised peace through submission and delivered only poverty and despair. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Whitfield commanded the patrol, a career officer whose reputation for brutal efficiency had earned him promotion and the bitter hatred of every Apache band from the Chiricahuas to the Mescaleros. He had been hunting Nalnish's people for 6 months, following reports of raids that may or may not have been committed by their warriors, determined to either capture them for relocation to the San Carlos reservation or eliminate them as a threat to settler expansion. The debate that erupted in the Apache camp revealed deep divisions about how to respond to this latest threat. Some warriors favored immediate flight deeper into the mountains, where cavalry horses would be at a disadvantage and traditional Apache tactics could be employed to maximum effect. Others argued for standing their ground, claiming that running would only delay the inevitable confrontation while making them appear weak to other bands who might be watching to see how Nalnish handled this crisis. Thaddeus found himself in an impossible position, pulled between loyalty to his new family and the uncomfortable reality that he was genetically and culturally identical to the men who represented an existential threat to their survival. His presence in the camp would be impossible to explain if Whitfield's patrol discovered them, yet leaving would abandon Ayana and her people at the moment when they needed every capable fighter they could find. The solution Ayana proposed demonstrated both her intelligence and her understanding of the delicate balance they were all trying to maintain. Rather than hiding Thaddeus or sending him away, she suggested that he could serve as an intermediary, someone who could approach the cavalry patrol without immediately triggering a violent confrontation. His presence would not guarantee peaceful resolution, but it might provide an opportunity for negotiation that would otherwise be impossible. The plan required Thaddeus to ride out alone to meet Whitfield's patrol, carrying a white flag and a story carefully constructed to explain his presence in Apache territory without revealing the location of the main camp. He would claim to be a prospector who had been captured and recently escaped, someone with information about Apache movements that might be valuable to the military. If he could convince Whitfield that the band had moved north toward the Mogollon Rim, it might buy them time to relocate to more defensible positions. The success of this deception depended on Thaddeus's ability to convince hardened soldiers that he was something other than what he appeared to be, while simultaneously providing enough useful information to make his story credible without actually betraying his new family. It was a gamble with stakes measured in human lives, and failure would likely result in his death and the destruction of everyone he had come to care about. Ayanna helped him prepare for the encounter, coaching him on details that would make his story more convincing, while avoiding information that could be used to track the real Apache camp. She cut his hair in a style that would suggest weeks of neglect, used plant dyes to create fake bruises, and rope burns that would support his claim of recent captivity, even tore his clothes in ways that would imply rough treatment without actually damaging their functionality. The morning of his departure, she presented him with a small medicine pouch that had belonged to her grandfather, explaining that it would provide protection during his journey and serve as a reminder of his obligations to his adopted people. The leather was soft from years of handling, worn smooth by countless fingers that had sought comfort in its familiar weight. Accepting it felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return, acknowledging that he was no longer simply Thaddeus Crane, the drifter, but something new and infinitely more complicated. The ride to intercept Whitfield's patrol took him across terrain that he was only beginning to understand, through canyons where the Apache had hidden from their enemies for generations, and across mesas that offered commanding views of the surrounding desert. Every mile that separated him from the camp increased his appreciation for the tactical advantages that made the Apache such formidable opponents despite their small numbers. They knew every water source, every game trail, every defensive position in this vast wilderness. Fighting them on their own ground would be like trying to capture smoke with bare hands. He found the cavalry patrol exactly where Apache scouts had predicted they would be, following an old mining road that provided the easiest route through the rocky landscape, but also made them visible from miles away. 24 soldiers commanded by an officer whose bearing suggested both competence and cruelty, riding in formation that prioritized military precision over tactical awareness. They were dangerous because of their weapons and training, but vulnerable because they did not truly understand the environment they were trying to dominate. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield proved to be exactly what Thaddeus had expected. A man in his 40s, whose weathered face bore the stamp of too many years spent imposing military solutions on complex cultural problems. His uniform was immaculate despite the dust and heat, his weapons well maintained, his manner that of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. When Thaddeus approached under his white flag, Whitfield's first response was suspicion rather than relief, suggesting that he had learned not to trust anything in Apache country at face value. The interrogation that followed tested every aspect of the deception that Ayanna had helped him construct. Whitfield's questions came rapidly and from unexpected angles, probing for inconsistencies that might reveal the truth about Thaddeus's recent experiences. How long had he been a captive? Which band had taken him? What had he observed about their numbers, their weapons, their apparent intentions? Where exactly had he escaped, and why had the Apache allowed him to live when they usually killed white prisoners immediately? Thaddeus answered with a mixture of truth and carefully crafted fiction, drawing on his genuine knowledge of Apache culture, while misdirecting attention away from Nalnish's actual location and capabilities. He described a band of perhaps 15 warriors, led by a chief he called Red Wolf, supposedly camped near Sanita Basin and planning to raid settlements along the Gila River. The details were specific enough to seem credible while being general enough to avoid creating information that could be verified or disproven through independent investigation. What made the deception successful was not the perfection of the lies, but the authenticity of the emotions behind them. Thaddeus's nervousness was genuine, his exhaustion real, his concern about Apache intentions absolutely sincere. Whitfield saw a man who had been through a traumatic experience and was struggling to process information that might help prevent further bloodshed. The colonel's suspicions began to fade as he recognized patterns that matched his expectations about how civilians typically responded to encounters with hostile Indians. The critical moment came when Whitfield offered to escort Thaddeus back to the nearest military post, where he could receive medical attention and provide a more detailed debriefing about his experiences. Refusing this offer would immediately raise questions about his true motivations, but accepting it would mean abandoning Ayanna and her people at the moment when they most needed his support. Thaddeus chose a middle path that satisfied military protocol while preserving his freedom of movement. He claimed that his prospecting equipment remained cached near his original capture site and that recovering those tools was essential to his economic survival. If Whitfield could provide him with a military escort to retrieve his supposed mining gear, he would be happy to submit to a full debriefing afterward. This proposal appealed to Whitfield's sense of efficiency while playing to his assumptions about civilian priorities. A prospector would naturally be concerned about valuable equipment left unguarded in the wilderness, and providing a brief escort would be a reasonable gesture of military support for a citizen who had provided useful intelligence about enemy movements. The bargain struck, Thaddeus led a detail of 6 soldiers on a circuitous route that took them farther from Nalnish's actual position while appearing to follow the logical path toward his fictional mining claim. The deception required him to navigate terrain he barely knew while maintaining the illusion that he was returning to a familiar location, all while ensuring that the soldiers saw nothing that might contradict his carefully constructed story. By evening, they had reached a site that could plausibly have served as a mining camp, complete with evidence of recent excavation and the kind of basic equipment that a lone prospector might have abandoned during a hasty escape. The soldiers helped him gather his supposed possessions, accepting his explanations about Apache tactics and prisoner treatment with the weary resignation of men who had heard similar stories many times before. When they parted company the following morning, Whitfield seemed satisfied that he had extracted all available intelligence from his unexpected encounter. His patrol continued north toward the Mogollon Rim, chasing shadows and false trails, while the real Apache camp prepared to relocate to positions that would be virtually impossible for cavalry to reach. Thaddeus's return to his adopted family was greeted with a mixture of relief and celebration that made him understand, perhaps for the first time, that he truly belonged among these people. His successful deception had purchased time that might mean the difference between survival and destruction, but more importantly, it had proven that the bridge between worlds that his marriage represented could serve practical purposes as well as symbolic ones. Ayana's welcome was particularly warm, combining personal relief with recognition that her husband had demonstrated both courage and cunning in facing a challenge that could have destroyed everything they were trying to build together. The medicine pouch had returned with him, apparently having provided the protection she had promised, and she accepted its return as confirmation that their partnership was blessed by forces larger than themselves. The reprieve purchased by Thaddeus's deception lasted exactly 11 days. Apache scouts brought word that Whitfield had discovered the truth about the mining camp, probably through reports from other prospectors who knew the area and could confirm that no serious excavation had ever taken place at that location. The colonel was now moving systematically through the desert, checking every canyon and water source, his methodical approach suggesting that he understood he had been deliberately misled by someone with intimate knowledge of Apache tactics. Worse still, Whitfield had been reinforced. 2 additional patrols had joined his command, bringing his total force to nearly 70 soldiers equipped with modern rifles and enough supplies to sustain an extended campaign. The military was clearly preparing for a comprehensive sweep of the region, designed to locate and eliminate every Apache band operating outside the reservation system. The news struck the camp like lightning hitting dry timber. Some families began packing immediately, preparing to flee deeper into the mountains where cavalry horses could not follow. Others gathered around Nalnish, seeking guidance from the elder, whose wisdom had kept them alive through decades of warfare and persecution. The children sensed the tension without understanding its source, their play becoming subdued as they absorbed the anxiety radiating from every adult conversation. Thaddeus found himself facing a crisis of identity that cut to the very core of who he believed himself to be. His successful deception of Whitfield had been possible precisely because he shared the cultural background and physical appearance of the soldiers hunting his adopted family. That same advantage now felt like a burden, a reminder that he could escape this approaching disaster simply by walking away, reverting to his old identity as a drifter with no permanent attachments or obligations. The temptation was stronger than he cared to admit. His marriage to Ayana, while legally and ceremonially binding according to Apache customs, would mean nothing to the outside world. He could disappear into the vast anonymity of the American frontier, find work on some distant ranch or in some remote mining camp, rebuild his life as if these weeks among the Apache had been nothing more than an extended dream. But watching Ayana help her people prepare for what might be their final stand, seeing the quiet dignity with which they faced the prospect of death or capture, he understood that running would destroy something essential in his character. These people had welcomed him not because of what he could do for them, but because they recognized something in him that he was only beginning to understand himself. They had seen past his rough exterior and violent history to find a man capable of honor, capable of standing for something larger than his own immediate survival. The debate about how to respond to Whitfield's approaching force revealed deep philosophical divisions within the Apache community. The older warriors favored traditional tactics, harassment and ambush, striking quickly and then melting back into the landscape, making the desert itself their ally in a campaign of attrition that could continue indefinitely. The younger men argued for a decisive confrontation, claiming that running would only postpone the inevitable, while allowing the military to dictate the terms of engagement. Hayana proposed a third option that initially seemed so radical that even Nalnish dismissed it without serious consideration. Rather than fighting or fleeing, she suggested attempting to negotiate a peaceful resolution that might allow her people to remain in their traditional territory while formally acknowledging American sovereignty over the region. Such an agreement would require significant compromises from both sides, but it might provide a framework for coexistence that could prevent the total destruction of Apache culture. The idea was not entirely without precedent. Other tribes had negotiated treaties that allowed them to maintain some degree of autonomy while accepting federal oversight of their activities. The problem was that most such agreements had eventually been broken by one side or the other, usually when economic pressures made Indian lands appear valuable to white settlers and developers. But Ayana's proposal had one crucial advantage that previous negotiations had lacked. Thaddeus could serve as a cultural interpreter and advocate, someone who understood both worlds and could help bridge the communication gap that had doomed so many earlier diplomatic efforts. His presence might convince military commanders that the Apache were genuinely committed to peaceful coexistence, rather than simply buying time to prepare for renewed hostilities. The plan that emerged from 3 days of intense discussion was breathtakingly audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Rather than waiting for Whitfield to find them, a small delegation would approach the cavalry commander under a flag of truce, offering to negotiate a comprehensive agreement that could serve as a model for resolving similar conflicts throughout the Southwest. Thaddeus would lead this delegation, accompanied by Nalnish and 2 respected warriors who could speak for the military societies that traditionally made decisions about war and peace. Ayana would remain with the main camp, both to coordinate defensive preparations if negotiations failed, and to serve as a guarantee that the delegation had not simply abandoned their people in search of individual safety. The night before their departure, Thaddeus and Ayana sat together beside their small fire, both acutely aware that they might never see each other again. The conversation that passed between them carried the weight of everything they had discovered about love and partnership during their brief time together, everything they hoped to build if survival proved possible, everything they would lose if the approaching confrontation went badly. She gave him a new medicine bundle, this one prepared specifically for the challenge he was about to face. Inside the soft leather pouch were items that connected him to her family lineage, a piece of turquoise that had belonged to her grandmother, a small carved bone that represented the protection of ancestors, a fragment of sage that had been gathered during the ceremony that made him part of the Apache community. This will remind you that you carry not just your own hopes, but the dreams of generations who have struggled to preserve our way of life in a world that seems determined to destroy it, she told him. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat, adding gravity to a mission that already felt impossibly difficult. He was being asked to save not just the immediate members of Nalnish's band, but the entire cultural heritage they represented. Failure would mean the death or displacement of people who had lived in harmony with this harsh landscape for centuries, the loss of knowledge and traditions that could never be recovered once they disappeared. The ride to intercept Whitfield's enlarged force took them through terrain that seemed designed to showcase both the beauty and the danger of the Sonoran Desert. Ancient saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly, their arms raised in gestures that seemed to offer either blessing or warning. Javelinas scattered at their approach, while red-tailed hawks circled overhead, riding thermals that carried them higher and higher, until they became mere specks against the infinite dome of heaven. Thaddeus found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the series of seemingly random events that had transformed a rootless drifter into someone willing to risk everything for people he had known for less than 2 months. Had he really changed so fundamentally, or had the Apache simply helped him discover qualities that had been there all along, buried beneath years of cynicism and disappointment? They found Whitfield's expanded force camped beside a natural tank that collected rainwater during the brief but violent storms that periodically swept across the desert. The military had established a proper perimeter with sentries posted at strategic intervals, their discipline and organization reflecting both professional competence and serious intent to complete their mission regardless of cost. The approach under a flag of truce followed protocols that both sides understood, but the tension was palpable as Apache negotiators rode slowly toward soldiers who had spent months trying to kill them. Rifles tracked their movement, while whispered conversations speculated about the wisdom of trusting Indians who had demonstrated remarkable skill at deception and misdirection. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield emerged from his command tent, looking like a man who had been expecting this development, his manner suggesting that he had already given considerable thought to how such a meeting might unfold. His greeting was formal but not hostile, acknowledging the courage required for former enemies to present themselves voluntarily while maintaining the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust appearances in Indian country. The negotiations that followed stretched across 3 days, with each side probing for weaknesses while attempting to construct a framework that could satisfy their fundamental requirements. Whitfield needed to demonstrate that his campaign had achieved measurable results that justified the resources expended and the risks taken. The Apache needed guarantees that would allow them to maintain some connection to their ancestral lands while adapting to the political realities of American expansion. Thaddeus found himself serving multiple roles simultaneously: translator when language barriers threatened to derail discussions, cultural interpreter when misunderstandings arose from fundamentally different worldviews, and mediator when emotions threatened to overwhelm rational discourse. His position was uniquely difficult because he was trusted by neither side completely, yet both recognized that their chances of reaching agreement depended largely on his ability to facilitate communication across a chasm of mutual suspicion. The breakthrough came on the second day, when Nalnish offered to relocate his band to a specific area that would place them under nominal federal supervision while allowing them to maintain their traditional lifestyle. The proposed territory included several important sacred sites and sufficient game to support their subsistence economy, but was remote enough to avoid conflicts with white settlers or military installations. Whitfield's initial response was skeptical. Previous attempts at such arrangements had failed, because Indian bands had used them as bases for renewed raiding, returning to warfare when reservation conditions became intolerable or when outside pressures made peaceful coexistence impossible. What guarantee could Nalnish offer that this agreement would not simply postpone rather than prevent future conflicts? The answer came from Thaddeus himself, in a proposal that surprised everyone present, including the man making it. He offered to remain with the Apache band as a permanent liaison, someone who could serve as both monitor and advocate, ensuring that the terms of any agreement were honored by both sides, while providing early warning if circumstances began to deteriorate toward renewed hostilities. This suggestion addressed several problems simultaneously. It gave Whitfield a way to maintain oversight without the expense and difficulty of permanent military occupation. It provided the Apache with an advocate who understood American legal and political systems well enough to protect their interests when conflicts arose. Most importantly, it created a human bridge between communities that had been taught to see each other as irredeemably alien and threatening. The terms that emerged from these discussions were more generous than anyone had dared hope, yet more restrictive than anyone wanted to accept. The Apache would be granted use rights to approximately 50 square miles of traditional territory, including 3 major water sources and several areas of spiritual significance. In exchange, they would acknowledge American sovereignty over the region, accept federal oversight of their activities, and refrain from any actions that could be construed as hostile to American interests. Thaddeus would serve as the federal representative to this quasi-autonomous territory, with authority to mediate disputes and coordinate with military commanders when problems arose. His marriage to Ayana would be formally recognized by territorial authorities, creating a legal framework that legitimized his position while symbolizing the broader reconciliation the agreement was meant to achieve. But the most crucial element of the agreement was also the most fragile. Success would depend on the willingness of both communities to honor commitments that ran counter to their historical experience and cultural expectations. The Apache would need to trust that Americans could keep promises made to Indians, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Americans would need to believe that Apache could be trusted to remain peaceful despite generations of warfare and mutual atrocity. The signing ceremony took place at sunset on the third day, with representatives of both sides gathering around a small table that had been set up in the neutral ground between their respective camps. The documents were written in both English and Spanish, with Apache concepts explained through oral interpretation that attempted to capture not just the literal meaning of terms, but their cultural significance. Thaddeus signed as federal representative, his signature creating legal obligations that would bind him to this place and these people for the foreseeable future. Nulnish marked the agreement with symbols that connected it to Apache traditions of treaty-making and sacred commitment. Whitfield added his name as military commander, accepting responsibility for ensuring that federal authorities honored the terms they had negotiated. The moment felt historic, pregnant with possibilities that could reshape relationships throughout the Southwest if the experiment proved successful. Yet everyone present understood that they had created nothing more than an opportunity, a chance to discover whether enemies could become neighbors when survival depended on mutual cooperation. The return journey to the Apache camp was subdued, with each member of the delegation lost in private thoughts about what they had accomplished and what challenges lay ahead. Thaddeus found himself thinking about Ayana, wondering how she would respond to news that her husband had voluntarily chosen to bind himself permanently to her people and their fate. He need not have worried. Her welcome was everything he could have hoped for, combining personal joy with recognition that their partnership had become something larger than either had originally envisioned. They were no longer simply two individuals learning to love each other across cultural boundaries. They had become symbols of possibility, living proof that reconciliation was achievable when people were willing to risk everything for the chance of building something better. The months that followed tested every aspect of the agreement in ways that the negotiators had anticipated and others that caught everyone by surprise. Federal bureaucrats questioned the precedent of granting semi-autonomous status to Indian bands, fearing that success might encourage similar demands from other tribes. Military commanders worried that the Apache territory could become a refuge for hostile elements from other regions. Settlers complained that valuable land was being wasted on people who would never contribute meaningfully to territorial development. From the Apache perspective, the challenges were equally daunting. Living under federal oversight required accepting restrictions on traditional practices that had defined their identity for generations. Young warriors chafed at being unable to raid enemies who continued to encroach on lands that had once belonged exclusively to their people. Elders worried that contact with American culture would corrupt their children and destroy the spiritual connections that gave meaning to Apache existence. Through all these difficulties, Thaddeus and Ayana worked to maintain the delicate balance that kept their experimental community functioning. They mediated disputes between Apache families and federal representatives, translated not just language, but entire ways of understanding the world, and demonstrated through their own relationship that cooperation across cultural boundaries was both possible and rewarding. Their first child was born in the spring following the agreement, a daughter whose mixed heritage embodied everything her parents hoped to achieve. She would grow up speaking Apache and English with equal fluency, comfortable in both worlds, yet fully belonging to neither. She would inherit traditions from ancestors who had never met, yet shared a common commitment to protecting the land and people they loved. The baby's birth was celebrated by both communities, Apache families bringing traditional gifts, while federal officials sent congratulations that acknowledged the symbolic importance of this new life. She represented the future that the treaty had made possible, a generation that would not be forced to choose between competing loyalties, but could synthesize the best elements of different cultures into something entirely new. As Thaddeus held his daughter for the first time, feeling the weight of her tiny body against his chest, he understood that his journey from rootless drifter to husband and father had been more than personal transformation. He had become part of something larger than himself, connected to both the past that had shaped him and the future that would be shaped by the choices he made. The desert sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had welcomed him to this place so many months earlier. But now the landscape looked different, no longer a wasteland to be crossed but a home to be protected. The Apache camp below buzzed with the quiet activity of people secure in their place, confident that tomorrow would bring challenges, but not annihilation. Ayanna stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, as they watched their daughter discover the world through eyes that would see possibilities her parents could barely imagine. Their love had become something larger than romance, deeper than passion, a partnership that had helped bridge worlds and might, with luck and determination, help build a future where such bridges were no longer necessary because the divisions they spanned had finally been healed. The story that had begun with blood and violence, with a stranger helping enemies against a common threat, had evolved into something that neither Thaddeus nor Ayanna could have envisioned when they first sat together beside their small fire. They had created not just a marriage but a model, not just a family but a hope that even the deepest wounds could be healed when people were willing to see past their fears, to recognize their common humanity. In the gathering darkness, with his wife and daughter safe in his arms and the promise of tomorrow stretching endlessly before them, Thaddeus Crane finally understood what it meant to belong somewhere completely. The desert had claimed him as surely as it had claimed the Apache, making him part of its eternal story of survival, adaptation, and renewal. He was home.